Hello, my friend. We need to talk about Canada's tourism industry, and I'm actually not going to start with whatever's going on over here. See, I just got back from a trip to Banff National Park, and there's one thing I can't stop thinking about. It was this strange small plaque that I saw on the side of a winding mountain road. The plaque read that a century ago, Canada advertised to tens of thousands of Ukrainian families to come and settle the western edge of this vast North American continent. Then they rounded the men up and pushed them into labor camps, and they forced them to build these iconic national parks. Whoa. If you didn't know about this, you're not alone. Because the more I learned about these atrocities, the more I discovered that what happened a century ago tells us a lot about Canada's immigration policy even today. And that raises a deeply unsettling question. How could someone go from being an immigrant that Canada had actively enticed to becoming a prisoner being forced to build Canada's national parks, all without ever having committed a crime? Canada justified their actions by saying that these people were enemies of the state, but just a few years later, they came out with another statement that completely undermined that reasoning. This is the story of how Canada's national parks were built on the backs of thousands of wrongfully imprisoned Ukrainians, and what that tells us about Canada's approach to immigration today. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. There's about 7 national parks in this area. This is the area known as the Canadian Rockies, and it's this epic mountain range with mountains shooting 13,000 feet up. They're dense and they're jagged and there are winding roads. It's just this incredible place. And spoiler alert, some of those winding roads are the same ones that Ukrainian immigrants were forced to build, but we'll get to that. Before this was a national park, this was not empty wilderness. There were people living here. Indigenous people like the Stoney Nakoda, Ktunaxa, Tsuut'ina, Secwepemc, Cree, and the Métis all had their traditional lands here. But around the 1870s, Canada was firmly in its westward expansion era. And with that came what we've seen across North America, where the Canadian government would basically sign false treaties with these indigenous groups and then break those treaties to take their land. Now, I share this because I feel like this sets the tone for what happens long into the future. Long before Canada began seducing and then imprisoning Ukrainian immigrants in this very area, there was a very clear mandate that the Canadian Rockies were going to be used for the benefit of Canada's tourism industry. So that's how we end up with tourism posters like the one I showed you at the beginning of this yeah, right, that one. Let's move on. With the region increasingly under government control, Banff was literally designed from the start to be a tourist destination. They developed the famous Banff Springs, and they built restaurants, and they laid railroad tracks for tourists to come and visit. Now, at first, this work was done by Canadians. You can probably guess what they look like. They were the typical mountain man who would work hard all summer and hunker down for the cold Canadian winter, probably drank a lot and smelled kind of bad. Basically the exact man that I aspire to be. But by the 1900s, things were changing. The automobile was the way of the future, and that's when things started to take a dark turn. See, it all started with this guy, Parks Commissioner James Bernard Harkin. He envisioned a world where tourists could drive through these epic mountains and explore the serene lakes and the beautiful valleys on their own without having to rely on the railroad. But in the early 1900s, this would require more men and more investment than ever before. Think of all the work it would take to cut the roads and build the bridges and borrow the tunnels through these epic Rocky Mountains. So the commissioner sold the idea to the Canadian government. Look at all this land, he said. Look at these beautiful mountains. We could create the jewel of Canada, and while we do it, we could find a way to help Canadians settle to the west. And the Canadian government ate it up. They said, yeah, we are going to invest in this. We see the vision. We're going to pay laborers an exceptional wage to go and live in camps so that they can work and build out this vision of the national parks. This was around the end of 1913. Do you know what happened in 1914? Correct. World War I. So basically overnight, all of these working age men had to go abroad to fight. All of the money that would have gone to national parks went to funding the war, and basically in an instant, Harkin's dream of building out this gorgeous national park system was put on hold, until he devised a cunning scheme. Harkin realized that there was a group of people living in Canada who could solve his labor shortage, and ironically, this was a group of people that Canada had spent years trying to convince to come over. Okay, so rewind a decade or so. The first major wave of Ukrainian immigration to Canada began in the late 1800s. It's actually a pretty incredible story. In 1896, this guy, a man named Clifford Sifton, he was Canada's Minister of the Interior, came up with this brand, essentially, called the Last Best West. This was a plan to convince immigrants to come and settle the western edge of Canada. So he set up immigration offices across Europe and distributed advertisements like this one that basically promised a set number of acres for European immigrants to come and take control of and get their own farms, and most importantly, they could come to Canada where they would be free of all kinds of messy European politics. And guess what? The plan worked. By 1914, about 170,000 Ukrainians had come to Canada, and they had settled mainly the area around the Canadian Rockies. But here is a crucial piece of the story. When I say Ukrainians, you're probably thinking of people from this country. But this country didn't exist back then. Instead, Ukrainians were an ethnic and cultural group that lived primarily in Austria-Hungary and a little bit in what is now modern-day Russia as well. So when Britain declared war on Austria-Hungary during World War I, many Ukrainians carried passports that made them enemies of the state in Canada. This was deeply unfortunate. Most Ukrainians from Austria-Hungary had very little allegiance to the country. They were ethnic minorities when they were living there, and they were ethnic minorities in Canada. Canada didn't care. In 1914, Canada passed the War Measures Act, which gave the government the right to arrest anybody that it claimed was an enemy of the state. So overnight, about 80,000 Ukrainians were forced to carry papers, they had to report to the police regularly, and they weren't allowed to leave the country. Now, of those 80,000 quote, enemy aliens, about 10,000 of them were labeled as dangerous, and they were rounded up and imprisoned. These people were largely young men, and many of them were unemployed or had been arrested while trying to flee the country. Something dangerous was happening that we have seen throughout history. Prejudice made these people suspicious, and then poverty made them disposable. And once 10,000 so-called enemies of the state were in government custody, Canadian officials began asking what useful work they could perform. Okay, so now that you have that context, let's jump ahead to Commissioner James Harkin. Remember him? He wanted men to build out his Canadian national parks. The Canadian government had a bunch of men who happened to be imprisoned and sitting around. It was a match made in hell. Internment camps were established in Banff and Jasper, Yoho, and Mount Revelstoke. Under Harkin's command, the men were forced to do all of the work that we had talked about earlier. They were paid about 25 cents a day compared to the average laborer who was making about $2.10 a day. It's hard to find primary sources from these camps, but the few letters that remain from the prisoners talk about horrendous conditions. And they're the type of conditions that we would become more accustomed to during World War II in the concentration camps. The prisoners obviously had very little control over their situation, but they did have the ability to withhold their labor. And in 1916, after months of poor treatment and facing the possibility of another winter in Banff, the men refused to work. Their strike continued through the summer, and similar disputes broke out in other camps. At Mount Revelstoke, the prisoners revolted and were eventually transferred out of that camp. After 2 years of labor, the system was beginning to crack. And then, the Canadian government made a decision that revealed just how poor their justification was. See, all of these working-age men were off fighting in the war, and Canada's economy was suffering. So suddenly they realized that they need men to go and work the jobs that, ironically, these Ukrainian immigrants had been working before they were imprisoned. They needed farm workers, then they needed railroad workers, they needed people in manufacturing and textile industries, the men who could do the labor that was creating Canada's economy. And so overnight, Canada realized that these men were more valuable to the economy outside of these prisons than they were inside. The Jasper and Yoho camps closed in 1916. The Banff camp closed in 1917, but the last camp didn't actually close until 1920, 2 years after World War I had ended. Heavy stuff. Okay, let me take a quick break. I want to tell you about how I'm going to finish this painting. I have the light wash and a lot of the middle values in here. I need to finish off with the darks, and that's my favorite part because the darks are when the whole painting really comes together. And in this painting, the darks are super dark. I'm going to get these big rough trees in here. I'm going to try to space them out unevenly so it doesn't look too false or manufactured. And I think that's going to finish this whole painting off. So why haven't we heard about this whole atrocity? Why don't we know that this is the backstory to Canada's most iconic national parks? Well, for one, the camps and the fences, the artifacts that remain from this era, are all gone, right? They're either underground, and in some cases they're preserved in local museums. But I think there's a bigger story here. For many Ukrainian Canadian families, the internment was also surrounded by silence for decades. In the 1980s, Ukrainian Canadian organizations campaigned for recognition, but it wasn't until 2002 that the Canadian government established a $10 million recognition fund to support the education and commemoration of Canada's First World War internment camps. Part of that fund went towards laying the plaques like the one that I stumbled upon that sent me down this whole rabbit hole. And don't get me wrong, these reparations do matter, but they answer the question of what Canada owes the immigrants of its past. There is a much bigger question that I think Canada is still wrestling with today, and it's the question that I will leave you with. Canada still depends on foreign workers. In 2026 alone, the federal government expects about 230 new temporary foreign workers to arrive in Canada. At the same time, they are trying to reduce the number of temporary residents by about 5% this year. Now, obviously, being a temporary foreign worker in Canada today is not even close to being an interned Ukrainian during the First World War. But I think the tension that Canada faces is very similar now to what it was back then. See, Canada has never had trouble knowing that immigrants could be economically beneficial to build out their country. The question is, what does Canada owe those immigrants when they are? Thank you for watching, and if you like this video, please do hit subscribe and check out my Patreon. I've got more stories like this and a community of people who are really interested in this kind of thing. And now I will leave you with this video to watch.